The Rebel Capitalist Show.
Do you think the dollar-denominated debt? I mean, I'm thinking through that in through the lens of what Brent talks about. I'm just thinking. So, do you think is it because the dollar-denominated debt got to an extreme in the shadows prior to the GFC, and the velocity slows down, so there's just not enough dollars out there, and that was the trigger? Or is there any way of knowing?
Well, as we talk, I mean, I'm glad you started out the way you started out, because thinking along these things in the lines of bank balance sheets, we're just trading, how do we get more money into the system? Well, it's not the Fed prints currency, paper
Right.
currency and adds. That
Right.
doesn't work. It's not
Right.
bank reserves either, because bank reserves tend to pool up only in a small, primary dealers and small part of the system.
Right.
The way you add euro dollars to the euro dollar system is by banks adding to their balance sheet, growing their balance sheets in size.
Lending.
Not just lending, but it can be all sorts of, creating deposit liabilities to pay for treasuries. I mean, that's a way of balance sheet expansion. It all comes down to bank balance sheet expansion. And what happened in 2007 was banks said, holy crap, all this stuff that we thought was riskless, all this crap that we've been doing that nobody understands, collateral, securities lending, all this other stuff. Well, it turns out it's really risky. And because it's really risky, the more I do, the more risk I take. And so I'm not going to do any more. I'm going to actually slow down what I do. So bank balance sheet in the aggregate started to slow its growth, and then actually in 2007, 2008 contracted.
And then you have more counterparty risk in the system between the entities doing business, and then that exacerbates the problem, I would assume.
It becomes a self-reinforcing process where one major dealer pulls back, which causes another dealer to pull. And it's all very incestuous too, because when a dealer's laying off risk, he's laying off risk to the next dealer. So if that dealer says, I don't want your risk, then you stop laying off risk too. It's a recipe for an uninterruptible implosion. Right. And that's really what happened, because how is the Fed going to stop balance sheets from shrinking? With bank reserves? That doesn't help. I mean, there's all sorts of these different forms. Think about collateral, think about derivatives. Credit default swaps were a huge thing because of how they were used in maintaining bank balance sheets and creating leverage on bank balance sheets. So, I mean, the Federal Reserve essentially at the end, and after the dust started to settle in 2008, September and October 2008, it wasn't about bank reserves anymore. It was about Maiden Lane. It was about taking on AIG's credit default swap portfolio or some of its dealer businesses, because bank reserves don't really matter to the system that spent decades doing all these other things except bank reserves.
So when you're saying that, my question was going to be, so what got us out of the GFC? Why wasn't it worse? And it sounds like just because through the balance sheet, scribbles on the piece of paper, they were able to instill confidence, which allowed which motivated, incentivized the banks to start expanding their balance sheet again. Is that correct?
No.
No. Okay. Not even close.
Did all that stuff September and October 2008. There was overseas dollar swaps. Forget the TAF auction. Let's just do blanket liquidity auctions. In fact, the Fed thought it had gone so far that it started to soak up reserves with reverse repos and IOER and all these other things. But that was September, October 2008. Crisis didn't end until March. And remember, between September 2008 and March 2009, that's when the global economy took its worst hit.
Right.
So it wasn't like the Fed was effective. And eventually, what stopped the crisis in March 2009, I'm absolutely convinced, and it's an arguable proposition, but to me, the evidence is clear. It was FAS 157. Which was market. When the Federal Reserve and the accounting regulators said you no longer have to mark to market your unmarketable or illiquid assets, that interrupted the chain, which caused balance sheet contraction in its biggest form. Like Citigroup, for example. Citigroup took, and I'm going off the top of my head, I think something like 20-some billion in losses in the third quarter of 2008, which was biggest loss ever. But it wasn't a real loss. It was an illiquid market loss. It was an OTTI, other than temporary impairment, that was required and forced upon it by FAS, whatever the existing accounting standard was before 157, which said, as these markets became more and more illiquid and prices kept going down and down, banks had to write down the value of their assets, which only caused other banks to say, I don't want to do any more money dealing activities anyway, because everybody's in danger of going bankrupt.
On paper.
Well, yeah, on paper. And the thing is, those ETDI and OTTI impairments were just paper losses from illiquid marketplaces. And once those stopped, it was no longer, there was no longer that huge, heavy liquidation, banks are going out of business type of negative pressure and perception that allowed at least the rest of the system to stop and say, okay, let's take stock of where we are. We've destroyed a hell of a lot of money and a lot of leverage. Maybe that was enough to get the system into a settled state. And as it turned out, without that pressure from mark to market, it was enough to create a settled state. It just an incredibly destructive settled state.
Yeah, right. So just for the terms of the average Joe and Jane might be able to follow a little easier. Basically, you got a house that
it's not
you buy
easy.
for $100,000, and so when you buy it, its value is $100,000. So that's an asset on your balance sheet. And but then what happens is the market tanks. You still own the home. You're still getting your rental payments. Let's say it's a rental property, but yet the value of the house goes from 100,000 down to 50,000. Well, it still doesn't really matter to you at all. You're still getting positive cash flow from it, but it really hampers your ability to borrow more money because the bank looks at your balance sheet and it's half the size as it was based on your cost basis. And that's kind of what we're talking about.
And that's exactly what we're talking. And it's really, and it's because the price of your home went down because your neighbors they were forced to sell because they didn't have the liquidity buffers and margins to maintain themselves with falling prices, which only, when you get into that kind of situation, it only contributes to the mess because their distressed sales and liquidations only force prices down even more. And soon, you get so far away from economic fundamentals, nobody cares anymore. In fact, everybody at that point, the only thing anybody cares about is liquidity. And that's, a system cannot function, a monetary and financial system just cannot function where everybody's sole concern is liquidity. Because eventually in that situation, everybody's simply going to hoard it. And they're going to hoard every single form of it, which is the exact opposite that you need for a healthy functioning system and economy.
When did the pre-GFC mark-to-market rule go into effect?
Oh, I think it's not something that was abnormal.
I'm just wondering because that seems like it would have
this.
Triggered way before that. It just seems like a ticking time bomb that just would have triggered often. You see what I'm saying?
Sure, but like everything else, George, it had a really, there was a place for it, and it had securitization, for example. This is what it really came from. Securitization was a good idea. It just got way out of control and bastardized and used for all the wrong purposes and then used too much. But securitization, if it had been left to a niche kind of a section of the market, yeah, you can take illiquid assets and make them liquid. There's always this desire, it's a legitimate desire on the part of the banking system to look at illiquid assets. Mortgage loans, they're illiquid assets. Mm-hmm. So how do you value mortgage loans? Well, the bank has a tremendous incentive to do that. They want to be able to value stuff that's illiquid. So securitization was one way you can make it liquid. Plus, you can make a repoable collateral out of it. But apart from that, you can create all these illiquid assets or pools of assets and try to create some kind of valuation to them. So you have liquid mortgage-backed securities that trade on the market, which you then presume tell you something about the value of these illiquid, non-tradable assets that are on your books.
Which was a 30-year mortgage.
Kind of makes sense in that context, except if these liquid mortgage-backed securities over here start trading haywire. The conditions in that market go nuts, and it becomes the value of these mortgage bonds go down and down and down because of things like credit default swap problems and a bunch of other stuff we don't need to get into. But that has nothing, correlation trading, for example, has nothing to do with the fundamental value of these illiquid loans that are on your balance sheet. But yet you have to mark to these mortgage bonds that are liquid because that's what the accounting rule and the law says.
Right.
Even though the value, the true economic value, money good assets on your books, they haven't lost any value. They're not experiencing wave of defaults or anything, but you have to mark to this other market price that's going nuts.
Right, to where you could be cash flow positive, but you're insolvent.
It's money good assets that are valued by inputs that are inappropriate. And when the bank said that in 2007, 2008, everybody said, "Oh, it's Wall Street just trying to get away with something here." But that was an actual true part of the crisis, that there was a mark-to-market problem. And Once the regulators finally realized it needed to sever that relationship, it again, as I said, it allowed the system to kind of take a step back and say, okay, how bad are things? Right. Because up until March 2009, we've been valuing all of everything, all this illiquid stuff, based upon really bad illiquid inputs from stuff that did trade. And once you didn't have to do that anymore, things didn't look as bad. I mean, yeah, it was really bad. It wasn't good, but it wasn't like end of the world, everybody's going out of business type stuff anymore, because you could finally say, Citigroup could say legitimately, most of these assets I've been marking down, I didn't need to mark them down. And I don't need to mark down any more assets because they really are money good. And it's just this trading inputs from the stuff that traded in illiquid markets that was causing all these problems, which, if you think about it, points a huge finger back in the direction of the idiots at the Federal Reserve, because the big problem was markets going illiquid, which, I mean, I was told from a young age, as you probably were,
yeah, the lender
that's
of
the
last
Fed's
resort.
job, right?
Yeah, the lender of last resort.
So as much as the Fed wanted to blame subprime mortgages and did over and over, when you actually take a step and look at it, one thing after another, the Federal Reserve was just a complete utter mess, total incompetence up and down.
How could they have provided lending as far as in that time frame, during 2008, 2009? What could they have done, or what should they have done maybe, to be the lender of last resort, to do their job?
I think the problem had gotten to be so big that there was no chance. I mean, first of all, you would have to, the Fed could use 13-3 for a lot of purposes, and they did. I mean, the maiden lane stuff was pushing it, the bailout of AIG and some of the Citigroup assets. There was a lot. The Fed stretched the boundaries, but in order to have been even theoretically or plausibly effective in 2007, 2008, the Federal Reserve would have had to have rewritten itself completely, top to bottom, refurbish what they actually did. Because I've said ever since Bear Stearns failed, if the Fed wanted to have any prayer of forestalling the crisis, they probably should have taken over AIG's credit default swap business. And I don't mean buying the assets and putting on maiden lane and just sheltering them away. I mean actually writing credit default swaps to becoming the credit default swap market itself, because the default swap market defined, especially for banks outside the U.S., especially for banks in Europe, they were using credit default swaps for something called regulatory capital relief, which was essentially gaming their balance sheets to make them to be able to pile more leverage into them. We don't need to go into the details of that either. But essentially, without credit default swap, with AIG having experienced trouble, banks, especially in Europe, but pretty much anywhere, the default swap market defined leverage on balance sheets. And so without the default swap market functioning, it caused essentially a collapse in balance sheet capacities.
Right. So it'd basically be like an internal repo.